Welcome to Tech Tuesday number 73. And today we're going to try to make the abstract and lofty talks about IP strategy and IP actions uh, more practical and down to earth. Well, it should be trivial why we do IP at all, but the reason we do it is in order to have some sort of effect on the world. And if we're doing it for business reasons, which we should be, it means we want to help the business thrive and we want to support business goals. So if you look at it in a more abstract way, there's the real world and things happen in the real world. And we want it to change. So we do something with IP, and then the real world changes because we did IP. And it doesn't matter if it's patents, trademarks, contract, suing somebody, keeping a secret, and so on. Now, the IP work itself is not only filing papers, but also has to do with detecting things, predicting, strategizing, planning, executing, and so on. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about this loop in three parts. But actually, it's not just three parts, it's actually three different loops. And all of these loops should be managed and hopefully using an in-house IP manager. So the first loop is a loop which connects the IP with the effect on the real world. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today mainly. The second loop links IP strategy to business result. Okay, it's not enough to have an effect on the world, it should be aligned with your strategy and so on. And the third loop has to do with your business goals and how the ecosystem responds. And we're not going to talk about that much because it's further away from IP. Now, a lot of companies don't have any closed loop. They work in an open loop method. Oh, we need to file patents. That's it. They file the patents. Did it work? Did it not work? Nobody knows. And obviously, that makes it much more difficult to be adaptable and to be efficient or even to be effective. Why is it so complicated to do IP? Because IP is never by itself. You need to affect the real world so you can ignore it. IP costs money and other resources, has to come from somewhere. Not everything you want to do is possible. There's time issues, cash issues, risk and uncertainty budgets. How much are people willing to risk? And IP is always about uncertainty. You need management attention, the good kind. The company itself has a momentum, it has a vision, it has other departments, it has other things it's doing, which, could interfere with the IP. And there's people outside the company as well. So all of these things need to be taken into account. Usually you would say that first we do strategy, then we have a plan, and then we execute the plan. And I start with strategy because IP is a strategic tool. So what kind of stuff would you do in this ideal world? You'd make a strategy, you'd identify needs, you'd find solutions, you'd make plans, resource allocations, do feedback, and so on. That's too much to talk about today. And instead, I'm going to talk about execution and planning and closing the loop. And I'm going to start with execution, even though it's the lowest level, perhaps because it's the easiest one to talk about. Everybody does execution. Okay, we file that patent. And there are a lot of details and I definitely didn't provide all the details, but I hope I'm going to show you enough of the details so it's clear that there's a big gap between abstract ideas about IP, like we'll file a patent and people will be scared, and what's actually involved. So let's start with execution. The starting point of execution is that hopefully we have an IP strategy, but we even have an IP plan, and the IP plan already defined specific IP actions to be taken for specific reasons. Okay? And that's only the beginning of execution. We just know what we want to do, but we haven't done it yet. And even during execution, you have to think about changing stuff, like the details of the actions that are in the plan, evaluating whether the action is actually going to work. We talked about time and money and risks and so on. Monitoring, how are we going to know that what we think we're doing is actually what we're doing? How do we know it has the effect that we want it to have? What do we need? People or skills or AIs or information about the world in order to do these actions and more. So, based on the story I just told you, do we have a clear target? Absolutely. We have a plan. We know what actions we need to do. Is a path we need to take clear? Of course. With experienced patent attorneys, we know how to draft a patent application, how to file it, how to register a trademark, and so on. Do we have the resources? Probably, if we got to the planning stage and somebody approved the strategy and budget. Is the outcome predictable? No, it's not. Now, we're going to assume for a second that strategy is already done, which of course it isn't. But execution requires dealing with the real world. Okay, execution is acting on the real world. And the real world is always much messier than the IP projections. All of us who have sat in meetings where we decided to do IP, when we actually do it, it's much messier. There's a lot of details. There's things you have to learn. The world pushes back. There's things that you don't know. There's things that are uncertain. Something can happen, a war, heaven forbid. And that means that even in the execution, we need to prepare for all of these messes that we have in the real world. And let me just take a few of these points and dig down a little bit. I talked about collecting information. So at least 4 different ways of collecting. One is passive browsing. That's what you're doing now. You're sitting and listening to somebody talk about IP. There's actively chasing, and you can do that, for example, on the internet, in a library, and so on. There's collaboration, where you're working with somebody, perhaps in the company, to get the information you need. And there's active information generation when you probe the world. Okay, let's say you want to do licensing. So you contact a potential licensee and you hear how many 4-letter words are used when you suggest they pay you money. Okay, that's valuable information. I mentioned there's constraints and collaboration, but if you're in a company, there must be collaboration with the other business functions of the company, because anything you do will affect them directly and indirectly. Anything they do will affect you. I gave this wonderful world where we have specific instructions, but guess what? The instructions are usually not specific enough. But even if they were, they need to leave some flexibility for the people doing the execution to be able to do. How do we know that we're doing the right thing? Well, we can hope and believe, or we can have checkpoints, tests, predictions, stress tests. All of these things have to be done. And there's always any decision we make during execution will have upsides and downsides. IP is a strategic tool, which means you can very easily do great good or do great damage. So you always have to consider whether publishing that paper or describing your formula for flavored over-sugared drink in your patent is something you should be doing or not. Okay, so I promised details, and the way I'm going to do it is by actually giving you examples. And there are going to be 5 examples today. First example, we have a startup company, and all of the examples are going to be about the same company story. So we have a startup company, and it wants to get a Series A investment. Classical situation. The product is some system that may be a robot that travels over drip line irrigations and fixes the drip emitters. You know, they get clogged, they get covered, so it goes along the pipe and it fixes them. Okay, that's a company and great need, and they want to get an investment, and the great minds have a strategy, and they decided before we got here that you're going to file patents on 3 different critical product features, and that will show the investors that there's a potential for your product to be unique in the market. Okay, and this is really a classic situation. Okay, so can we just go out and write these patents? No, we can't. Here's a few steps we're going to do. One is data collection. Well, first we have to identify more than 3 potential critical features. And in order to do that, we need to be sure that we know what is the product, what is the market, what is critical about the intersection of the product and market, what are the alternatives people can use, because if they have an alternative, then you might be critical, you might be unique, but you're not going to be valuable. We're doing all of this in order to make an impression on investors. So what do the investors expect? What due diligence methodology are they going to be using, for example? What kind of claims do they want to see? These investors, what do they believe about IP? What do they think about when the patents need to be filed, granted, prosecuted, and so on? And there's more information as well. I said I'll be light on the details. Next thing we do is we have to filter, okay? So we had 5 potential critical features, but maybe there's prior art. Maybe if you look more deeply, it's not critical. Maybe if you look more deeply, you'll see it doesn't make the right impression on the investors. And if you can't find enough, you're going to go back and look for more. We've done all of that. Now we get to the actual process where we're going to execute. So there's 2 parts to it. One is we have to figure out what do we need in these applications. Okay, what embodiments, what figures? Remember, we want to make an impression on the investors. The figure I have here on the right is not going to make an impression on the investors. What kind of claims do we need to see? How are we going to decide when we probably have to change the procedures we have in our unit on what is decided to be critical? And then we have to build, perhaps inside the unit, a few processes. For example, whatever we do in the IP will need to be aligned with the teams that are making the story and making the presentation to the investor. So we have to set up some sort of collaboration. We have to decide how quickly to get the patents. part of the IP we're going to show is going to have to do with trade secrets. And of course, marketing is a big frenemy in that aspect. The company can't fail. So we have to make sure that what we think we're doing is actually happening. So we have to define checkpoints where we check and see that our plan is on track and we still have enough time to fix it and the quality is acceptable. All of this is being done in order to impress investors. My experience is you usually have more than one potential investor, and perhaps you learn from one investor what you need to have. So you need to have some sort of mechanism so the IP people get feedback from the investors so they can adapt whatever it is they're doing to match the investors. Okay, now you do it. Or not. What went wrong? Okay, this story happened, and here's typical things that might have gone wrong. You were supposed to write on 3 critical features, but you only found 2 critical features because one of them has an alternative, so it's not really critical. You found that during the filter stage, which is what you're supposed to do, but you had to choose a less critical feature. So now you have 2 good critical features and 1 so-so. You look into your investors and you discover that some of them want to see broad claims. Some of them want to see narrow claims, but that have a search done which proves that they are really viable. Of course, you didn't discover this at the beginning, you discovered it during your checkpoint. So it's good that you had a checkpoint, but it's bad you didn't do it earlier. So you had to do a search, a prior art search, and luckily for you, you didn't find anything, but it could have gone the other way. You won't believe what happened 2 weeks before the first investor presentation. You finally got a look at the presentation slides, and they only showed 2 of the critical features. So what are you going to do? You try to convince presenting people to modify the presentation to add the feature, your third feature. They didn't agree. So instead, you filed a divisional application, more cost, of course, on a different feature which isn't the presentation, but is less critical. Okay, and because this investor process takes a while, you get some final rejections, the product changes from the patent. What you used to be critical is now not critical anymore because of new technology. And there's also all sorts of consequences in the market, which maybe you did or didn't think of. Okay, this is all execution. Okay, we got clear instructions. We know exactly what to do. We know exactly how to do it. But when we actually do it, there are a lot of details we have to collect, and it can go bad. Give you another example. Same company has 10 patents and 6 applications, and they want a revenue stream. And they decided, again, the genius is up on top, that if we license out 3 patents, that should give us a good revenue stream. Okay, you need to collect data. How much money are people willing to pay? How big is the market? Who are your potential licensees? So you have specific licensees where maybe they're infringing, and you have generic licensees where maybe your IP is at some important pinch point. We have 16 pieces of IP that I listed here, and maybe we also have trade secrets, so you have to discover which one of these IP elements are of interest and potentially licensable. And maybe you can do new filing, so it's even more than that. And yeah, if you license out IP, how does it affect your competitive advantage? What about your collaboration options? Will it improve or worsen your interaction with the ecosystem. So we collected all of this information, and now we apply filters. Anything that has prior art, we probably shouldn't try to license. Anything that has design around options, things that have a future prosecution where all sorts of things might happen, who's willing to pay, what is the risk to the company, and now part of the execution is modifying your claims to make them better for licensing or better for licensees. You have to start thinking about the contract terms in your licenses. This is part of an overall strategy. And you have to start building, again, some internal processes, maybe in the IP unit, that talk about two different things. One of them has to do with our uniqueness. If you license patents, you can be less unique because people can do what it says there. But also, your instructions were money, but when you license, you also have the potential to get non-monetary compensation or generate power. You can't ignore it even though you weren't told about it. Okay, so we do it. Okay, we select the patents, we market it, meaning the potential licensees. We contact them, we negotiate with them, and after we sign whatever we sign, we have to make sure they're actually paying. And if we have non-monetary power, want to use it. But guess what? Things can go wrong. One of these patents that you selected has a re-examination request filed against it. Maybe it's one of your potential licensees, but more important, you have to move budget to defending this IP, and you have to choose a different patent, but maybe there is no other patent. The great minds figured the return on investment in this process will be 3 years, but guess what? It's 7 years. That means you have to charge more money. And the technology half-life is 5 years. That means that it's not enough to license these patents. You have to build some sort of IP stream, new patents and R&D. And you have to build your own capability of drafting patents which are suitable for licensing. It's not the same thing as drafting patents for suing people. And of course, the people that you contact and ask for money, they give you some pushback. Maybe you lower your rates. Oops. Maybe it takes time to sign them. Maybe this time gives your potential licensee the ability to design around. Obviously, what you're going to need to do is modify your IP strategy and your portfolio planning to take licensing into account and not just do it as an afterthought. What if your targets sign a license, but they're not paying you enough, and you're not able to prove that they're selling 2,000 units and paying only for 1,000 units? You need better, more visible IP, which you might not have. Okay, that concludes the first section. We knew what to do, and we're just doing it, and it's not easy. Let's look at the beginning. We have to go from needs to IP actions. Defining it artificially as receiving a business need from the business people. Now, this might sound good, but it's actually not good. Why? It means the IP function is acting in a reactive way, and it also means that the instructions you're getting are as if you're a black box. Just do it. Go to the store and buy me 2 pallets. Go to the market and rent out 3 pallets. And I know everybody on listening to this is going to do it differently, or not. In any case, what we're doing is a planning activity. Okay, so we're doing more analysis and more strategic thinking, and it's further away from the outcome. So there's more guessing going on, and that means that you really should have more checking and building in flexibility. Now, if you're familiar with Likes model talks about military, but it doesn't matter, strategy, the ends we want to reach, the ways we can get there, and the means, the resources we're going to use. And if you can align them, you call that a strategy. Maybe it's closer to a plan, but that's what you're doing. Now, we did execution, and you know that whatever plan you make, execution is not going to follow it in a trivial way. And even if it's not for any of the reasons I gave, but just because the world is always changing. Let's go straight into an example. A company is doing a design freeze, and they're saying, oh my God, we're doing a design freeze. We're worried about freedom to operate. Okay, actually, we're worried about IP risk. So they tell you, do a freedom to operate. So we'll know that design freeze design is not infringing anybody's patents. Well, first step you have to do is what is a real business issue? And we'll see it in a minute. What possible solutions to this real business issue can you provide using IP? So doing FTO is one solution, and buying a patent is another solution, and I could go on. How are we going to choose between the different solutions? This action that we're planning now, is it part of a whole strategy, or we're just doing it? And last but not least, any output of this process, how is it going to be used? Okay, if we prepare freedom to operate opinion, down the road, how will it be used? Then we have to plan trivial stuff like budget, people who might work with you or might cause problems, risks you might have, including leaks. If people find out that you're worried about freedom to operate, that might interfere with all sorts of activity of the company. What exactly is your goal, and what is the probability of getting there? We might fail. Are we allowed to fail? Any case, there's a lot of other data to collect. Who are the other players? What resources do you have? Not what do you need? What is your time window? And what is the product? Okay, if we're doing freedom to operate, we're not yet at design freeze, and even after design freeze, some things can be changed. So we have to know where they are. Done all of that, we put together a strategy. And part of the strategy in this case would be a decision tree. If this happens, we go here. If this happens, we go there. Here's alternatives. It includes what actions you're going to do. It includes milestones, checkpoints, selling speeches. You're going to have to convince people to do all sorts of things you want them to do. And of course, you need full cooperation of R&D and marketing. So you have to put together the right kind of communication channel. So what are you actually going to do at this planning stage? Okay, we're not doing the FTO yet. We have to do a broader risk analysis. We have to find the best scope for the work we're going to do. Identify freedom to operate as the best way to move forward. And if there are other ways, you should decide if they're fallback or if you're going to do them in parallel. It's not enough to do freedom to operate. You need cooperation of other departments. For example, marketing shouldn't go out admitting what it is you're doing, especially where it's potentially risky. And people in conferences shouldn't be talking to strangers and telling them exactly how they're infringing patents. And you need to verify that all of this plan can work, can be done, and most important, will be allowed to happen. That the other powers in the company will allow this freedom to operate opinion to be done. And guess what? Turns out it's a real issue is that the company wants to exit, to sell as a product line to a buyer who's very strict about freedom to operate. In that case, you're going to need to have more data on what being strict means. You did risk analysis and you discover that there's more work than you expected because there are two other places where you have a risk. While you're collecting data, you find competitors that you didn't know about. This competitor has a patent portfolio. Now we have two questions to ask. One, what about the patents? And two, what about the competition? What about the competitor himself? Is a competitor himself a risk? Will they do business moves against you? I mentioned you should be doing trade secret analysis and you identify contamination and leak problems. Okay, so contamination is where maybe it doesn't belong to you. So you're not infringing anybody's patent, you're just using a patent that doesn't, its invention isn't yours. Your budgeting was for freedom to operate, but you forgot to consider you might need to do a small redesign. You might need to have another FTO on the small redesign. And of course, you're only going to discover during execution, which we haven't started yet. Not easy to plan. Another example of planning. It turns out that checking a drip emitter to see if it's good or not good is not easy. But there's a lot of universities studying just that. So maybe we can license IP and technology from a university. And the IP would be a better, more reliable way to evaluate drip emitters. Okay, let's talk about analysis. What do we expect to get from the university versus what do we need in order to license it? And part of it is components, and part of it is people. We need to have these people working with us. Part of it is exclusivity. It doesn't help us if we get the technology, or maybe it does, but also one of our competitors does. When you license from somebody, there's all sorts of restrictions. Which restrictions might apply and which ones can we live with? How are we going to integrate that technology into our company? And there's always a problem of addiction. You start working with an external R&D supplier, and before you know it, you can't do it yourself. And then the supplier says they're going on a sabbatical. We get to data collection and we ask who can actually provide that. TRL is technology readiness level. Are they selling us something at level 2 or something at level 8? Not invented here, we're all familiar with that. It means that a company might be unable to accept technology that comes from outside. In any case, we put together negotiation points and processes for inside the company in order to make use of that license. We plan a royalty monitoring mechanism so we don't pay too much. We build all sorts of mechanisms to avoid paying. And since we're licensing somebody else's knowledge, we probably have to keep secrets. We search for potential licensors. We verify that we're willing to pay the company and so on. And only now do we get to the point where somebody actually approaches these companies, but that's execution, and starts talking to them about licensing their technology. What goes wrong? Typical stuff. The IP the academia has wasn't drafted to enforcement, and the technology ignored freedom to operate issues. This academia is working with competitors, so anything you tell them will appear on TV tomorrow. Academia is not practical. Technology readiness level is not everything. There are pieces missing. which academia doesn't care about and you do? Was it planned how you're going to make it up? The researcher suddenly decides they're not interested in this technology, so they stop answering the phone. And last but not least, the people in your company, it turns out, don't even know how to evaluate the quality of what they're getting from the university. Should have spent more skill building on that. Okay, so I gave you planning and I gave you execution. And when we're done with execution, we're going to go back to planning. So we have a complete loop. Now, in between, there's a sense-making step. Okay, so we're sensing something in the world, we understand what's going on, and then we decide that IP is the answer, and we go into planning. And this really means that we have to have feedback and learning functions all over the place. And the questions we ask is, who is providing this feedback and learning function? So I'm suggesting IP, but it could be a different answer. The very fact that I'm talking about a loop means that the relationship with other company functions is really a relationship and not a one-off. Now, I want to caution that just because you're closing a loop doesn't mean you're doing strategy. You can have an overall strategy, and independently, every time something happens, you change the world, and then you do more IP and change the world again. Hopefully, it's aligned with your strategy. Example number 5. One of your friends, okay, tells you that a major drip irrigation company, remember we're only making the refurbishing, has been talking to its clients about refurbishing of drip systems. And that is definitely a sign that they might want to enter the market, but they didn't call you, which means that they want to compete with you. Maybe. Business instructions, okay, from the CEO say, if this major irrigation company is, only looking and sniffing around, convince them to stay out. If they started moving in, slows them down. And the best thing that could be is if they decide that they should be calling you and should be collaborating. So without going into details, the selected solution is some sort of mixture of patents, trade secrets, deception, and signaling. And of course, we have to keep track of whether this entry is happening or not happening. And we have to have a separate logical part of the IP group, which is looking into collaboration. And it could be that IP on version 2.0 is what's needed. So it was planned to delay it, but now you really shouldn't be delaying it anymore. In the planning stage, we put together a plan that fits the budget and we analyze all sorts of scenarios to detect failures, pushbacks, and opportunities. In the execution phase, it turns out, not surprisingly, that great IP is not so available. The marketing department doesn't like what you're doing. It's not so clear because nobody could find out what this opponent is doing. But you did file 4 patents, identified 6 valuable trade secrets which you're protecting, and you did 3 different deception operations which had positive feedback. Now we're adapting what we're doing. Based on this, IP should get more budget, should put more effort into deception, and since we're missing information, we should be encouraging third parties to probe this opponent and hopefully get more information. 2 milestones were set, one after 6 months, where you wanted to see a reduction of 50% in this noise about maybe somebody else wants to move in, and this was met. And the second milestone was after 8 months to hear signals that people want to collaborate, and this was not met. We wish the company the best of luck. You might be asking, since I already said twice, where does strategy fit in? And I'm saying again, just repeating this loop that you see in this picture, even if you're learning in the middle, is not strategy, or at least it's not strategizing. There's something called surfing, that you do whatever the world says and you go with it. And it really should be the other way around. You should have an existing IP strategy. Any activities that you do should be considered in view of that IP strategy. And any activity you do can change what your strategic options are. And if you notice, this picture has a lot of arrows in it pointing out, and that's because at each one of these stages, you should be getting input, let's call it feedback or feed forward, which you use in order to inform the IP strategy. In any case, I hope you have some sort of intuition now how much you're missing when you're working reactively and working in an open loop mode where you don't even look at feedback. So I would perhaps summarize it as doing IP is an opportunity to strategize. I mentioned milestones and I mentioned checkpoints. I can't without mentioning the word KPI, key performance indicators. And I want to point out there's two different KPIs that I've been talking about. One have to do with the loop itself. If you remember during the planning and during the execution, we talk about things we're going to measure. But you also have KPIs of the overall strategy, which also have to be kept track of. IP strategy, but it can go all the way to business strategy. Usually we assume that IP strategy is just subservient to business strategy, but that is not true. Just in a trivia level, what if the IP strategy is unable to provide the desired outcome? That means it's a business strategy, but even just the distribution of expectation and resources between different company functions is going to have to change. But more than that, IP works together with other functions, so it's a bidirectional relationship. And more interesting is that when you do IP work, you can discover and create opportunities for the business and or prepare fallbacks. And that's another reason why feedback at every stage needs to be considered, but all the way back to the business strategy. In conclusion, IP needs to be connected to the real world. And we're talking about planning, execution, strategy, and feedback, working with others and adapting. Even what appears to be simple actions, like an FTO, have a lot of work before the work. You know, the actual doing the search, analyzing the claims. Emphasizing again that just reacting to events, even if you're doing in the cleverest way possible, is usually not strategy. And I'd like you to think about this at home. All of these things I talked about, how can AI help? And if we're not using AI, what is the right division of labor between in-house and external IP counsel, management, and so on? And in fact, can all of it be done using consultants? I think not, but you don't have to agree. So tying this all together with a very similar example, look at these following events and ask yourself, what will the planning process look like and what will the execution process look like? Somebody discovers that drip irrigation works best underground, but our robot travels, above ground. What if we find out that a leading drip irrigation manufacturer, maybe that one from before that is sniffing around, they own a patent on the technologies that we're actually using to travel along the pipes. What if we decided that we don't really know how to travel along the pipe, so we want to collaborate with the companies that does? Okay, that's what's for home. Now I'm going to stop the recording.